I always thought that by the time I hit 72, I'd be at peace. After all, isn't that what you're supposed to have earned after a lifetime of hard work? My hands, calloused from decades of working construction, aren't as strong as they used to be. They ache at the end of the day, reminding me of the years of lifting, hammering, building. My back? Well, it creaks every morning as if it's protesting getting out of bed. My knees, they groan too, like old hinges begging for oil. But you know what? My mind is still sharp. It's clear, clearer now than when I was younger. I remember everything, every decision, every mistake, every triumph. And in my quiet moments, I reflect on all the missed opportunities. What could I have done differently? What did I lose along the way? My name is Aldrich Poundstone, and I've worked my whole life as a construction superintendent in Brunswick, a small town where everyone knows everyone and nothing stays a secret for long. I've supervised the construction of half the buildings downtown, including the new library and municipal building, and I've built dozens of houses, some of them for the very people I pass on the streets. It was a good life. People respected me for my work, and I was proud to say I could provide a decent life for my family. My wife, Eleanor, was a wonderful woman, quiet, with a soft smile and eyes that reminded me of the autumn sky, warm and inviting. We lived together for 45 years, and during all that time, I never questioned how lucky I was to have her. We had one daughter, Viola, and she was the joy of our lives. Eleanor passed away 3 years ago from pancreatic cancer. The disease took her quickly, almost too quickly, and before I could even grasp the reality of losing her, I found myself alone in our big house on Maple Street. It was a house we had picked out together when we first got married. The house had been neglected and needed serious repairs, but I saw potential in it. It had character. I spent every weekend fixing it up, remodeling, and updating. I built a new fireplace in the veranda overlooking a small garden where Eleanor planted roses and hydrangeas. It was more than just a house to us. It became an extension of our lives, our history. After Eleanor died, I couldn't bring myself to move. Neighbors and a few friends suggested that the house was too big for a lonely old man, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't leave the place where I had spent so many years with the woman I loved. I stayed in the house, even though it grew emptier and quieter with each passing day. Viola, after graduating from college, moved to Portland, where she worked as an interior designer. I wasn't surprised when she met Hubert Tinker, a thin man with sharp features and a permanent scowl on his face. He worked for a commercial real estate construction company, and Viola told me he was a fast riser. But when I met him at their wedding 6 years ago, I didn't see the spark in his eyes that you get from someone who is truly passionate about what they do. It was as if he was going through the motions. When Eleanor died, Viola flew in for the funeral, stayed for 3 days, and then flew back to Portland, citing an important project she needed to finish. I didn't blame her. Everyone has their own life to live, and I'd never been the type of father who demanded constant attention. We called once a week on Sundays, and that was enough for me. I learned to live alone. I cooked simple meals for myself, kept the house in order, sometimes met with old colleagues at Frank's, the local bar, to catch up on city news and reminisce about the good old days. That was my routine. I was content, if not completely happy. And then, out of the blue, Viola called. She said that she and Hubert were moving to Brunswick. Hubert's company was opening a branch office there, and he had been offered the job of running it. She spoke quickly and excitedly, and although I sensed there was something she wasn't saying, I was so happy to hear from her that I didn't question it too much. She said they would stay with me for a while until they found a place to live. "It'll be good for you, Daddy," she said. "It's hard for you to live alone in a house this big, isn't it? We'll help with cleaning, cooking. I agreed without thinking. The thought of having Viola's voice in the house again, drowning out any lingering doubts. They arrived 2 weeks later, Hubert driving an impressive black SUV with Viola beside him, looking a little different. Her hair was freshly cut, and her face wore the kind of expression that told me she was doing something she didn't want to do but felt she had to. "Daddy, you've lost weight," was the first thing Viola said as she hugged me. Her perfume expensive, sharp mixed with something I couldn't quite place, and it hit me. It was the life she had been living away from me, a life I wasn't a part of anymore. Hubert shook my hand dryly, his eyes scanning the house with the same appraising gaze a realtor might use. I showed them to the room I prepared for them, the former guest room upstairs with a view of the garden. Hubert just grinned awkwardly, and Viola smiled uncomfortably. "We were thinking of taking the master bedroom, Dad," Viola said, her voice sounding casual. But there was something in the way she spoke that made me pause. "It's more spacious, and it has its own bathroom." I froze. The master bedroom was mine and Ella Leonard's. Her things were still there. The perfume bottles on the dresser, the book she hadn't finished, the glasses in their case on the bedside table. I hadn't been able to bring myself to move those things. It was as if, with her things still in the room, a part of her was still there with me. My voice sounded foreign to me when I replied, "I'll move my things into the study." That evening, I packed up my belongings and moved into the small room that had once been my office. I set up a cot, moved the essentials of my clothes, and left everything else behind. Viola and Hubert took the master bedroom. I could hear them rearranging furniture, opening and closing drawers, throwing things away. It felt as though they were erasing everything that had been part of my life. The first few days felt like a blur. Viola cooked complicated meals, dishes I could barely pronounce and with flavors that I couldn't quite get used to. Hubert, as usual, left early in the morning and returned late in the evening, always with the same disgruntled look as if everything and everyone owed him something. I tried to stay out of the way, spending my time in the garden or in the garage where I had set up a small workshop. I wasn't sure where I belonged anymore, but I was doing my best to adapt. A week later, Viola told me she had been offered a job at a local design office. She'd be working there all day too. And in the weeks that followed, I began to notice the small but significant changes in the house. The refrigerator was growing emptier, and the house was becoming increasingly cluttered. One morning, while Viola was rushing around, putting on her makeup in the hallway mirror, she asked, "Daddy, could you go to the store? We need milk, eggs, and something for dinner, and we're out of laundry detergent too." I agreed, of course. What was wrong with helping out? After all, they were living in my house. But as the days went on, more and more of these requests came. "Daddy, could you wash my blouses? Daddy, would you iron Hubert's shirts? Daddy, can you vacuum the whole house today?" At first, I didn't mind. I had nothing else to do, and I was happy to be helpful. But something was changing. The tone of these requests shifted. They started to sound less like favors and more like orders. The gratitude was no longer there, and I began to feel like I was invisible in my own home. Then, one evening, when the three of us were having dinner, one of those rare occasions when Hubert managed to be home on time, I asked, "How's the search for a place of your own going?" Viola and Hubert exchanged a quick glance. I could feel the tension in the air before she answered. "You know, Papa," she said, twirling a strand of hair around her finger, a nervous habit she had since she was a teenager. "We've been thinking. It might make more sense for us to stay here." "Stay here?" I asked, feeling a cold lump form in my chest. "It's a big house," she said quickly, avoiding my gaze. "You don't really need it all by yourself, do you? We could help with the bills, the repairs." "Repairs?" I echoed, a feeling of unease creeping over me. I glanced around the dining room, where every detail, every piece of furniture had been carefully chosen or built by me. The house was in excellent condition. "Well, that's what you think," Hubert interjected, cutting into his meat as if it were a personal insult. "The roof needs replacing. The wiring is outdated and the plumbing's a mess." It felt like my whole world was crumbling around me. Every day I could feel myself shrinking into the background of my own home, my own life. I had built this place with my own two hands, piece by piece, but now it seemed like I had no say in what happened to it, no place in it anymore. They had invaded every corner, every room, and they were slowly pushing me out, replacing everything. I knew with their own demands. One afternoon, after I had spent the day running errands and getting soaked in the rain, I came home to find Hubert pacing in the living room. His phone pressed tightly to his ear, and his voice rang out in frustration. "No, it won't work that way. I need this deal." "You don't understand. I can't." He stopped mid-sentence when he noticed me entering the house. His eyes flicked to me for a brief moment before he abruptly cut the conversation short. "I'll call you back," he said before hanging up. I stood there, drenched, my old umbrella broken halfway through my walk back from the store. I hadn't bought a new one, saving what little money I had from my modest pension. I left wet footprints on the floor, which I had just mopped that morning. My joints ached, but I tried to ignore the discomfort. The house, once a symbol of my pride, now felt foreign to me. As I walked into the kitchen, Hubert appeared in the doorway. His gaze fell on the wet marks I had left behind. "Can't you see what you've done?" he snapped, his voice dripping with contempt. His finger pointed to the floor, the marks of my wet shoes glaring at him like a personal insult. "I'm sorry," I said tiredly, already reaching for the rag. "I'll clean it up." "Damn old man," Hubert muttered under his breath. "You're more trouble than you're worth." I froze. The words stung like a slap, and I could feel a heat rise inside me that I hadn't felt in years. The anger, the resentment, it was all bubbling up. But I remained silent, not wanting to escalate things further. Without warning, Hubert snatched the rag from my hand, his face contorted with fury. "Is this how you mop the floor?" he sneered. With a sudden motion, he threw the wet rag at me, and I stood still as it splashed across my face. Cold, dirty water ran down my cheeks, dripping onto my shirt collar. I didn't move. My body froze, not from the cold, but from the humiliation. I could feel the wetness on my skin, the sting of his words still lingering. I wanted to lash out, to scream, but I remained silent. "Wipe yourself, servant," he spat, his voice dripping with malice. "That's what you're here for, to clean up after us. You're no good for anything else, you old git." The sting of his words hit harder than the wet rag ever could. I stood there, my hand slowly reaching for my face, wiping off the water. My movements were mechanical, but something inside me snapped. Something deep within me rose, a force I had long buried. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't fear. It was rage, a quiet but fierce anger that I had pushed down for so many years, for 40 years. I had managed construction crews, settling disputes, negotiating deals, resolving conflicts. I had earned respect, built relationships, and worked my fingers to the bone. And now, in my own home, I was being treated like this by a man who hadn't earned a fraction of the respect I had. I took a deep breath, my eyes narrowing as I met Hubert's gaze. "Hubert," I said quietly, my voice low but firm, "you've crossed the line." He let out a harsh laugh, a sound that was far worse than any insult. "What line, old man?" He scoffed. "You're living in my house, eating my food. This is my house." "No," I interrupted him, my hands shaking now not with fear, but with the force of the words I was finally speaking. "This is my house. Every nail, every board in it was made by my hands. and I won't let you do this to me." Before Hubert could respond, Viola walked into the kitchen. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, but her eyes betrayed the weariness, the anxiety that had been growing between us for weeks. She looked around the kitchen, her gaze briefly lingering on the wet footprints on the floor. Then on my wet face, and then on Hubert, standing there with the same smug look that had become all too familiar. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone carrying the same rehearsed authority she used when she was trying to sound older than she was, when she was trying to convince everyone, including herself, that she had everything under control. "Your father," Hubert began, his voice already laced with frustration. But I didn't let him finish. "Your husband threw a rag in my face," I said, keeping my eyes locked with Viola's, "called me a servant in my own house." I waited for her response: outrage, defense, or at the very least a hint of daughterly love, but there was nothing. Viola sighed, a heavy, exhausted sound. "Papa, did you make Hubert angry again?" she said, her voice laced with an impatience I hadn't heard from her in years. It wasn't anger. It wasn't concern. It was more like she was scolding a naughty child. "You know he's going through a rough patch at work. He needs to pay attention. He's stressed." Something inside me snapped. I had been trying to hold it together for so long, afraid that if I spoke out, if I challenged them, I would lose my daughter. But now, as I stood there, humiliated in my own kitchen by the man who was supposed to be family, I realized that I had already lost her. I'd lost her long before this moment. Maybe it was when I allowed her and Hubert to cross my threshold, with their fake smiles and empty promises of care. Or maybe it was even earlier, when I couldn't find the strength to maintain the connection after Ella Laner's death, when I let the distance grow between us without doing anything to stop. "I'll mop the floor," I said, my voice quieter now, but filled with a resolve I hadn't known I still had. "And then we need to talk." Viola and Hubert exchanged a look, one that I couldn't read, but it was filled with something I didn't want to know. They turned and walked out of the kitchen without saying another word, leaving me standing there alone with the dirty rag in my hands, my heart heavy with sorrow and frustration. I slowly knelt down, my knees protesting against the position, but the physical pain was almost a relief, a distraction from the deeper pain that had taken root in my chest. I began wiping the floor, scrubbing away the marks as if I could somehow scrub away the humiliation. But no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I tried, the resentment only grew. When I was done, I stood up, my knees aching, my body exhausted, and I looked around the kitchen one last time. It wasn't my house anymore. Not really. It hadn't been for a long time, but I would not let them take this from me. Not without a fight. I had built this house, and I would be damned if I was going to let it be torn apart by the very people I had welcomed in with open arms. I would fight for my place, for my dignity, for my family. I just didn't know yet if I could win. And so, as I stood there, wiping my face, I made a silent promise to myself. This was my house, and I wasn't going to let them erase me from it without a fight. Not now, not ever. I stood there for a moment, leaning against the kitchen table, feeling the weight of everything settling in my chest. Outside, the day was unfolding in the soft light of a spring evening. The sun dipped low, casting a golden hue on the treetops, and a light breeze danced through the curtains. The scene outside seemed so peaceful, so in harmony with the world, and yet, inside, my soul felt out of sync. The tranquility outside only highlighted the chaos inside me, a chaos I could no longer ignore. I looked down at my hands, rough, knotted, worn with age, but still strong hands. These hands had built things. They had hammered nails, lifted beams, kneaded cement, and turned screws. These were the hands that had hugged Ella Laner, held my daughter Viola when she was a baby, and worked tirelessly to provide for both of them. And yet, here I was, in the home I had built, a home that was slowly being stripped from me, not brick by brick, but moment by moment. I moved quietly up to my room, which had once been my study, now transformed into a cramped shelter. There weren't many things in this room: an old dresser, a narrow bed, a bookshelf filled with tattered construction manuals, and a few detective novels I had been rereading. It was hardly the comfortable refuge I had hoped for. The room was sparsely furnished, and the only picture on the wall was one of Eleanor and me on the front porch of this house. We were young, happy, hopeful, looking at the future with nothing but possibility ahead of us. I sat down on the edge of the bed and covered my face with my hands. I was tired, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. How had I allowed things to get this far? When had I stopped being the master of my own home and become a wordless servant? When had I let my own daughter and her husband treat me like a burden to be dealt with rather than the father and father-in-law they should have respected? Memories began to flood my mind, memories of a time when things were different. I remembered Viola as a child, with pigtails and freckles on her nose, coming to me with her little homemade birdhouse, asking for help. I remembered her as a teenager, full of rebellion, arguing with me about curfew. I remembered her in her prom dress, so beautiful, yet so distant, like a stranger I was only beginning to understand. I remembered her wedding day, standing next to Hubert, whom I had disliked the moment I laid eyes on him, but I had stayed silent, believing that a daughter should choose her own path, even when I saw that it was a path that would lead her into uncertainty. Maybe that was my mistake. Maybe I had always backed down, always allowed Viola to do things her way, even when I knew it was leading her somewhere I didn't approve of. But I had kept quiet, thinking that's what a good father did, gave his daughter the freedom to make her own decisions. In hindsight, maybe I should have said more, done more. Since Eleanor's death, I had become a shadow of the man I once was, an old man who feared loneliness more than humiliation. I didn't realize how dark it had gotten outside. There were voices downstairs, Viola and Hubert arguing, but I couldn't make out the words. I didn't go down to dinner. I had no strength left for them, nor did I have any desire to see their faces again. Instead, I stayed in my cramped room, my mind racing, caught in the current of my own thoughts. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I tossed and turned in the narrow bed, my body aching, my mind refusing to shut down. I listened to the creaks of the old house, the rustling outside my window, the wind that seemed to know my sorrow. And within me, my thoughts swirled like autumn leaves caught in a gust of wind, tumbling aimlessly. By morning, something had shifted inside me. I had made a decision. No more silence. No more hiding in the background. I wasn't going to let this continue. I would regain control of my life, my home. I didn't know how exactly, but I was determined. The change would begin today. The morning was clear and cool, a crispness in the air that felt refreshing against the heaviness of the past few days. I got up earlier than usual, seeking solitude. I wanted to drink my coffee alone, to gather my thoughts before the inevitable confrontation with Viola and Hubert. But when I walked into the kitchen, Hubert was already there. He was in his expensive robe, a cup of coffee in his hand, his eyes glued to the screen of his laptop. He didn't even look up when I entered. The room felt heavy with the silence between us, and for a moment I wondered if he even realized I was there. I quietly poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. Hubert continued to ignore me, his fingers tapping nervously on the countertop. Something wasn't right. Usually, he was already dressed and out the door for work by now. But today, he looked different, troubled, uneasy. Problems at work? I asked, partly out of politeness, partly to break the silence. Hubert looked up at me as if he had just noticed I was sitting there. "None of your business, old man," he snapped, his words sharp like a slap. You'd better get on with your breakfast. Viola will be down soon. I could feel the anger rising in me again, the same anger I had felt the day before. But I knew this wasn't the time for confrontation. Not yet. I swallowed my frustration, forced myself to stay calm, and replied with feigned resignation. Of course. I stood up to grab the pan, but before I could, Hubert's phone rang. He flinched, glanced at the screen, and cursed under his breath as he stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. The house, old as it was, didn't have thick walls, and his voice, though muffled, was still audible. Yes, Lance, I got your message. Hubert's voice was urgent, almost pleading. No, it's impossible. We can't drop the price any lower. It's ridiculous. I kept my back to the stove, pretending to be busy with the eggs, but my ears were straining to hear every word. Look, Hubert continued, his voice growing softer, the company is worth a lot more. We have projects in development, contracts lined up. Yes, I know about those rumors, but they're exaggerated. He paused, then spoke again, this time with even more desperation in his voice. Okay, I can come at 2. Yes, I'll be there. But Lance, this has to stay between us. If the board finds out I'm looking for a buyer behind their backs. There was a muffled noise, the sound of the phone hitting the floor, followed by another curse. I turned away from the stove, trying to mask my growing curiosity. A few seconds later, Hubert came back into the kitchen, his face pale, sweat dotting his forehead. I have to leave, he said, his words rushed, avoiding my gaze. Tell Viola I'll be back late. And just like that, he was gone, slamming the front door behind him, and I was left alone in the kitchen with nothing but the scrambled eggs and the whirlwind of thoughts in my mind. I stood there, stirring the eggs mechanically, but my mind was racing. Hubert had been acting strange for weeks, and now I knew why. He was in trouble. Serious trouble. The rumors, the phone calls, the way he'd been avoiding us, it all made sense now. He was trying to sell his company, and he was doing it behind the board's back in secret. A few minutes later, Viola came down the stairs, already dressed for work, her purse slung over her shoulder. She greeted me with a strained smile. Good morning, Daddy, she said. But there was something in her voice, something I couldn't quite place. Where's Hubert? He's away on business, I said, not turning around. He'll be back late. Viola sighed, then sat down at the table. I placed a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her and poured fresh coffee. We ate. In silence, the weight of what I had overheard hanging in the air. I wanted to say something, to confront her, but I didn't know where to begin. The silence stretched on, uncomfortable, like an unspoken truth neither of us was willing to face. Finally, I gathered the courage to speak. Viola, I said, my voice steady but firm, we need to talk about what happened yesterday. She looked up at me, her eyes tired, dark circles beneath them that no amount of makeup could conceal. Daddy, let's not do this right now. Okay, I have an important meeting today. I'm late. No, I said firmly, my tone leaving no room for excuses. Not now. I can't take it anymore, Viola. The way Hubert treats me in my own house. The way you let him. Viola put down her fork, leaning back in her chair. What do you want me to say, Papa? She asked, her voice tinged with frustration. I looked her straight in the eye. An apology. Well, I apologize for Hubert, she said with a half-hearted sigh. He can be, abrupt. But you have to understand, he's going through a difficult time. Things at work aren't easy for him. I don't want an apology, I interrupted. I want respect. I want you to stop treating me like a servant. I want you to stop letting him do this. I want to know what's really going on, Viola. Why did you move to Brunswick? What happened in Portland? Viola turned pale, her eyes darting away from mine. I don't know what you mean, she said, her voice trembling. Hubert has been offered a position here. I told you. Stop lying, I said, my voice sharp. I hadn't raised it, but there was a steeliness to it that surprised even me. I know Hubert's in trouble. He's trying to sell his company, isn't he? And he's doing it in secret. What's really going on, Viola? Viola stood up abruptly, knocking over her coffee cup. The dark liquid spilled across the table and dripped onto the floor. She was furious, but I saw the fear in her eyes. Were you eavesdropping? Spying on him? She snapped, her voice rising in anger. I wasn't spying, I answered calmly. Hubert spoke loudly enough for anyone to hear. And don't change the subject, Viola. I have a right to know what's going on in my own house. Viola grabbed her purse and keys, throwing them onto the table. You don't understand anything, Papa. You live in your own little world, thinking only of your own comfort, your own grievances. We have real problems. What problems? I stood up, looking her straight in the eye. Tell me, I'm your father. I can help. Viola laughed bitterly. Help? What can you do, Dad? Your measly pension. Your stories about building houses 50 years ago? Hubert's right. You're good for nothing but mopping floors and making breakfast. Her words hit me harder than anything Hubert had ever said. The last thread that had bound me to the daughter I once knew and loved snapped in that moment. I understand, I said quietly, my voice low but filled with finality. I understand now, Viola. Thank you for your honesty. Viola froze. It was as if, for the first time, she realized what she had said. The weight of her words hit her too, but it was too late. The damage was done. Something flashed across her face, remorse, regret, but it was quickly replaced by a mask of cold indifference. I have to go to work, she said, heading for the door. And don't tell Hubert what you overheard. You're making things worse. She left, leaving Melone in the kitchen with spilled coffee and a broken heart. I sank slowly into a chair, feeling my strength leave me. All my life, I tried to be a good father, working hard, providing for my family, being there for them when they needed me. And this was how it ended. Scorn and humiliation from the only person I'd loved for since Ella Laner's death. I sat there for so long, not moving, not thinking, just letting the pain flow through me like a river through rocks. Then I got up, wiped up the spilled coffee, washed the dishes. The mechanical acts helped me gather my thoughts. By noon, I had made a decision. No more being a victim. No more letting my dignity be trampled. I'm going to take back control of my life, and I'm going to start right now. I don't know how yet, but I'm not going to take any more humiliation in my own home. Maybe overhearing Hubert's conversation will give me a clue. If it's having business difficulties, if he's secretly trying to sell the company, there might be an opportunity for me. I went up to my room and pulled a metal box of important documents and bank statements from under my bed. After Eleanor died, I was left with a good amount of money from the sale of our share of the family business. I'd always been frugal, and that money was lying around untouched for a rainy day. I think that day has come. Perhaps Hubert's business is the key to restoring my dignity. I need to find out more about Tinker Construction and what's going on there. Maybe my experience in the construction industry will come in handy, and maybe I can turn this situation from humiliating to a profitable for me. For the first time in a long time, I felt a surge of energy and determination. I didn't know exactly how, but I was going to change my life, regain my respect, and show Hubert that old dog could still bite. After that conversation with Viola, I spent a few days thinking about the situation. I couldn't get Hubert's overheard phone call out of my head. A company on the verge of bankruptcy, secret negotiations for a sale, fear off the board of directors. All of it pointed to serious problems in my son-in-law's business, and perhaps an opportunity for me. I started cautiously. The first thing I decided to do was to test the validity of the information I had overheard by chance one morning after Viola and Hubert had left for work. I sat down at the computer in the living room. 15 years ago, when the internet was just entering our lives, Eleanor had insisted that I learn how to use it. "Don't be a dinosaur, Aldrich," she'd said, pushing toward the monitor. I resisted, but she was persistent, and now I was grateful to her for it. I typed Tinker Construction Portland Problems into the search box. It didn't take long for the results to come up. Several articles in local business publications mentioned Hubert's company in a negative way. Tinker Construction blows off center. Construction deadline. Investors express concern about Tinker Construction's financial situation and possible lawsuit against construction company for breach of contract. The articles were dated within the last 6 months, just before their sudden move to Brunswick. The next query was Hubert Tinker business biography. There wasn't much information, but enough to form a picture. Hubert had inherited the company from his father 5 years ago. Prior to that, he had worked for it in a management position, but apparently had no real experience managing construction projects. His education is a bachelor's degree in business administration. No technical background. In one interview, he proudly proclaimed plans to expand business, enter new markets, and double turnover in 3 years. I hummed reading this. I stood there, staring at the kitchen table, feeling a wave of frustration wash over me. The situation had gotten far beyond anything I had ever imagined. I had been content in my life, taking care of my home, doing things the way I had always done them. But now, here I was, caught in the whirlwind of a financial crisis I had no part in creating, but was being dragged into nonetheless. I couldn't help but think back to the early days when I first started in the construction industry. Ambition without true knowledge of the field was like a ship without a rudder. The construction business demands more than just a grasp of finance and marketing. You need to understand the craft, how buildings are put together, how crews are managed, how to judge what materials are best for the job, and how to keep everything running smoothly. Without that, you're doomed to fail. Unfortunately, Hubert, it seemed, had no understanding of that. He had ambition, yes, but it was misdirected. My curiosity grew as I dove deeper into my search, desperate to understand more about Hubert's company, Tinker Construction. I found myself on a builders forum where industry professionals were discussing issues with Tinker's contractors. Some complained about late payments. Others mentioned how the company was cutting corners by using subpar materials to save costs. There were complaints about taking on projects too big for them, only to make it worse by trying to pass off the responsibility on the contractors. One person wrote, "The signs are all there. Tinker Construction is in deep trouble." That's when I knew for sure something was wrong. I could gather a broad picture from what I read online, but it wasn't enough. To truly understand the state of things, I needed inside information, something more specific. For that, I needed people from the industry who knew the ropes, who had seen the inner workings. And that's when I remembered my old address book. It was worn, with faded pages and numbers I hadn't dialed in years, but it still held the names of people I had worked with over the decades. Some were long gone, others had retired, but there were still a few I kept in touch with. The first name that jumped out was Frank Abbott. He and I had started our careers together at the same construction company years ago. We were young then, both eager to prove ourselves. While I stayed in the field as a foreman, Frank had moved into management. He eventually started his own construction supply business, and it had grown into a sizable company, one that spread across the state. It had been years since we last spoke, but we'd exchanged a few holiday greetings here and there. I wasn't sure if he'd remember me or if he'd even answer, but I decided to give it a shot. I dialed his number, holding my breath. After a few rings, I was relieved to hear a familiar voice. Abbott here. Frank, it's Aldrich Poundstone, I said, feeling a slight twinge of nerves. There was a brief pause, then Frank's voice boomed on the other end, full of surprise and warmth. Aldrich, damn old fox, it's been a long time. How are you, buddy? Hearing his voice again brought a flood of memories back of days spent on construction sites, working side by side, eating lunch together, arguing over the best way to do things, and unwinding at Mike's bar after a long week. Frank was loud, but in that way that made you feel comfortable, like everything was going to be okay. The memories felt like they were just yesterday. I'm alive and well, as you can see, I replied with a smile. I decided to call an old friend. It's been a long time since we talked. We exchanged pleasantries about our health, our families, and the years that had passed. After a bit of small talk, I finally took a deep breath and got to the point. Frank, I need your help. I'm looking for some information about a construction company, Tinker Construction. You ever heard of them? There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Frank asked cautiously, Why do you want to know? I could feel the tension building, the heaviness of what I was about to say. My daughter's husband is Hubert Tinker. He's the owner of the company. Oh, Frank said, his voice changing slightly, a bit guarded. And what exactly do you want to know? I paused for a moment, deciding to be as honest as possible. Everything. Financial situation, reputation in the market, their ongoing projects, any problems they might be hiding. I have reason to believe that not everything is as smooth as they try to make it look. Frank whistled low, his surprise audible. You've got me curious, Aldrich. I never thought I'd hear you asking about corporate drama. What's got you interested in that? Life's made me interested, Frank, I said, my voice more serious than I intended. I wasn't about to go into all the details of the situation with Hubert and Viola, especially not over the phone. Well, I'm out near Brunswick right now, inspecting one of our branches, Frank said, his voice taking on a businesslike tone. We can't discuss something like this over the phone. Let's meet. I can stop by this afternoon around 4 o'clock. That work for you?